Hello, this is Joy Allen. I'm the Customer Success Manager for NetApp, and I am out of the Michigan office. So good morning to those of you on my time zone, and good afternoon or evening to those of you across the world. Thank you very much for joining. I did want to let you know you're all muted on entry. There is a chat window for questions, so feel free to type your questions in the chat, and we'll get those answered for you. I'm very excited today to have Miles Kniep with us, and he's going to talk to us about leveraging queries and dashboards within OCI. So Miles, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Joy. As Joy mentioned, I'm the Customer Success Manager for the EMEA market. Some of you have probably dealt with me in the past. I used to be a technical resource in the support organization, so if the name rings a bell, that might be why. So to get started, I know that queries and dashboards, typically you kind of struggle with getting those implemented. When I'm going and doing customer assessments, I see kind of mixed results where maybe one admin is a power user, really comfortable building queries and dashboards and handing those out to other users. And then others, they log in and they're trying to dig through things manually. And so we kind of have a sort of a gap with regards to who's able to access what. So kind of what we'll go through today. First, we'll kind of talk about why dashboards matter, what you can do with them. We'll go through the fundamentals of what queries are. I won't spend too much time on this because it's really just the basic tenets that you'll need to understand to work with dashboards. Then we'll kind of look at what's available in the automation store, fundamentals of dashboards, and then I'll walk through a demo of how to build one. So beginning with the reason for them in the first place, oftentimes you may have issues where if you're on the operations team of one form or another, storage, virtualization, whatever it may be, you may have some difficulty with actual application owners understanding when to engage you or when not to, and things like that. So classic example is if, for example, MySQL or something is running slow, nobody's really sure whether to engage. If they own the MySQL instance itself, they don't know whether to engage the storage team because of slowness, the virtualization team because of maybe something going on in ESX, and things like that. Building a dashboard can kind of help solve that because you could build something for that particular group of users, and they can simply log in and see that. So a couple things on what you can achieve here. Obviously, OCI's data is very broad, very deep, and manually navigating through that can be quite time-consuming if you don't know what you're looking for, at least. Users oftentimes don't know where to begin, as I mentioned before. Unless you're an expert on the whole environment, then you might be just fine. But in terms of the regular consumer, that's oftentimes a challenge. So the dashboard helps address a lot of that, though, because you can build something for specifically the VMware admin or some of your cloud users and things like that, so that they don't have to go do all of that digging. It saves a lot of time. So moving into the fundamentals of a query, let's just kind of walk through this here. The whole point here is that you can easily extract the data you need about a particular set of objects. So rather than having to go to vol 0, find out info about it, then vol 1, etc., you can build a query about a set of things built off particular naming convention, particular annotation. That can be very useful, especially across multiple storages or data centers, things like that. And then with that query result, you can use that to pull out of REST API. You can use it in annotation rules, use that for assigning applications and business units, and also export to CSV if you're importing that into maybe some other tool. So with regards to how to build a query, if you've not done it before, or if you already have, maybe some of this will still help. First thing you have to do is choose an asset type. From there, you should then probably build a view of what attributes you actually want to know. So if you're familiar with SQL, that's the equivalent of when you type select and then name your column names. Then you should go through and filter on the basics. So are you only caring about VMs that are on or off, things like that, or maybe things that only belong to a particular business unit. And from there, you can start drilling down on things like, I only want virtual machines that experience more than 10 milliseconds of latency and that sort of thing. If you don't follow this particular order, that's okay. But for the case of, or I guess the sake of making things simple and easily repeatable and implementable, this is kind of a good framework. And then, of course, make sure to click Save. I can't tell you how many times I have moved on and then realized that I didn't save my work. So just a aside there. You also have multiple operators available to you. You can use star or asterisk to represent any number of letters or numbers. I have an example there for you. You can use question marks to basically provide wildcard for a single character. And you also can use OR to do multiple sets of entities, and then also not. So I have some examples here for different combos you can do for that. Any questions so far regarding queries before I move into an example? Oh no, I see Jim is on the line. Hi, Jim. So moving forward, since there are no questions, this is kind of just a summary of what I see people ask a lot, whether that's here within NetApp, at customer sites, whatever it may be. Basically, someone needs to track something. They don't really know how to go about it. They just know they need to. So breaking it down to the fundamentals, first, we know that they want to view VMs. So in the query, we'll select the asset type of virtual machine. From there, we know that they want something that is from production. So we'll say, in this case, all of our development things are named scale. So we'll say not scale star. Going onward from there, we only care about the ones that are powered on. Simple enough. Select power state as a filter option. Only choose the on VMs. Moving further, we want the things that are local, the ones that that particular team needs to know about are the ones that they can manage directly on site. Going still further, we only want the ones that experience latency of more than 5 milliseconds. So in this particular example, I actually had a set of, I think, 700 or 800 virtual machines. And by filtering this down, I only had about 15. So it makes it pretty easy for me to know what I should maybe look into next. And from there, you can maybe make an annotation rule or put this somewhere so that people know kind of what their agenda for the day might be with regards to things to investigate. And so here's kind of your final output. I already had designated, I want to know the memory utilization, CPU, and latency. And I can also see what applications those particular VMs are tied to. Any other questions before we move on to an overview of dashboards? No? Okay.
No questions.
All right. So what makes a dashboard? Dashboard is really just a collection of widgets. Widgets are different ways to visualize data in OCI, always about multiple assets. I guess you could filter it down to one, but at that point, you may as well just go to the asset landing page for that particular thing. The same tenets I just kind of walked through are what you would use when building the widget. One thing to keep in mind, though, is you don't have to build a query to then use a widget, because then kind of the issue you might have is that, I guess as a design choice within OCI, what you would have is we change this query and suddenly both our annotation rule and our dashboard have changed behavior when maybe we only want to impact one or the other. So here's a representation of just some of the types available. The most common ones I see people use are the time series representations. So things like spline charts and stuff like that. That's very fancy. It looks nice. But oftentimes when you're only using that, it doesn't really give you much actionable information. So my recommendation usually is to start with something like an aggregated value representation, something as simple as a table, so that you have a list of items, and then you can filter down to, okay, here are the charts that will be useful to me. And I'll kind of show that in the demo here in a few moments. If you're not aware of it, the automation store has a few solution packs available. There's one specific for NetApp, one for VMware, and then there's also just a general storage one. If you only have NetApp in your environment, the storage admin one won't do much more outside of NetApp. the NetApp Solution Pack, but it's at least available. And these are all fairly recent, so I definitely recommend keep an eye on this site because there might be new things being added to it in the future. So with that, how do I make my data readily consumable and meaningful? As mentioned with the query, first thing we have is typically a question. Which approach here would provide more value? Usually somebody will come to you and say, I want a dashboard that shows me all the latency for these particular things. Oftentimes it's sort of a reference to maybe something like Performance Advisor, if you're familiar with that, or maybe something like Grafana. And Grafana is very, very powerful. However, in many implementations I see there, it's usually a list of spline charts. So with regards to what's actionable, again, depending on implementation, that can be a challenge. Maybe a little bit more efficient way of looking at it is to say, okay, I know I need to view latency on these VMs, but not only that, I need to understand whether that correlates to the utilization or whether that correlates to the underlying storage. So a few things to keep top of mind. I recommend, as mentioned already, start with a summary widget. This gives you sort of a reference point for everything else. Put together a few widgets that help you understand those problem points, and then you should add maybe some of the overviews for other resources you might want to investigate. So the example I might use would be start with virtual machines, get all the relevant information for that, add a widget for the data stores related to those virtual machines, and then also something for the volumes that those data stores are sitting on. But if you simply just add them all kind of, bundled together, the workflow direction can be maybe a little bit confusing. So we have about 15, 20 minutes left. Any questions before I go into a demo?
Not seeing any questions.
Okay. So here's what we'll build. I put this dashboard together yesterday, I believe. One moment here. Okay, so I guess to walk through this really quickly, what I built here is a reference chart for latency on our various applications. Underneath that, we have a list of all VMs that might exist within those. Latency as it relates to swap rate, also utilization as just a scatter plot. Then we also have just a general performance overview for all of those machines. In some environments, you might be worried about the ratio of read to write ops. So I also added a chart here for what's our percentage of total ops that are actually write operations. And then lastly here, we have a data store overview and a volume overview. And I'll kind of walk through how to build that. Something that is pretty useful, though, is, for example, here, maybe I've been told by a particular owner that they have some issues with the sales application. I can filter here, and then I can see here only the application, only the VMs that relate to that particular application, and the same is true all the way down. The exception here is going to be data store, because data stores aren't assigned to an application. So generally what you would do is say, okay, I see these virtual machines are tied to this data store, and I could go filter on that as well, like so. Actually, I can see that there's one labeled scale as well, but we don't collect performance on it.
And Miles, there is a question in the chat window too as well. He wants to know, Jim is asking, is it possible to export the data from performance without using REST API?
That would depend, Jim. From the dashboard, I don't believe so, but from the query, I think there is an export to CSV. That might be what you're talking about. Sorry, let me open up the chat window here. So really quickly, as an aside, because that might oftentimes be a question, I'll just use port errors as the example here. These are only link resets, but one option here should be this export button. And you see here that it provides a CSV. So worth checking out. Otherwise, yeah, latency you can add. Yep. So coming over here to creating the actual dashboard. First thing, you'll just have blank. I'll say I want a 3-day window. You can, of course, change this on the fly. First thing I may want is some variables. And maybe I'll name this one application name. Make another one VM name. And one more data store name. So I have those. Before I continue, because I'm very prone to accidentally hitting the X button, I'm going to click Save, and I'll call this the new application performance overview. Cool. You can see we're still in edit mode after saving. If you want to exit that and just view it, you simply click off. Pretty straightforward. So first thing I may want here is going to be a spline chart that gives me a visual, I guess you could say, call to action when I first log into this. Because if there's one particular app that's way out of line with the rest of them, that will be pretty obvious to me. So application latencies. Maybe I'll want a legend as well, even though we're currently not doing much. I'll choose an asset just like in the query. We'll say a virtual machine. And I'll go ahead and say latency max in this case. I think on the original I used total. First thing I'll do is high priority applications in this example. Next thing I'll do is application, and we'll say application name. And so what this means here is if I were to type a value into that variable I created, it will filter here. Name, same thing. Here we'll say VM name, since we're querying on virtual machine assets. Roll up max by all. You'll notice this only gives us one chart. That's kind of a problem. Doesn't really help me much. I will change this to application, and you'll see what happens here. Now I have something usable. And you have other options here. You could also go by business entities, the whole list of metadata. But for this case, I'll say application. And I think top 10 is fine. I make it a little bit more approachable, top 5. And we'll click save. That's way too small. So let's draw that out to full width as sort of a banner type of thing. Save so I don't accidentally delete it. Okay, so that's kind of my reference point, but there's nothing really actionable there, right? So let's go make a new widget. We'll say a table. Virtual machines again. Oh, I should probably name that. We'll say application VMs. And we'll filter by application. Again, same value. We don't need to add a new one or anything. What that does is that basically will filter the whole page. Application priority high. The reason I'm doing this bit is so that any virtual machines that wouldn't be in one of my high priority applications won't even show up in this list. So I don't have a lot of noise from maybe the other several hundred that aren't associated to the important apps. I'll say name again. I think I just saw something come up on chat. I'll check on that in a second here. And let's also say data store. Which actually, did I? I did, okay. There we go. Now, with regards to what I would like to display, because just the name doesn't help me much. We'll say the app. Maybe. There we go. Maybe the hypervisor name. And lastly, the data store. So this kind of gives me a good reference point on what does that VM belong to, where does it sit, and on what storage. And I don't think we want to do any grouping here. That would, I think, just be a little bit confusing. So then we'll click Save. Maybe make that a bit bigger. Oh, still can't see all my columns, though. Let's bring it out to about there. Click Save.
So Miles, there was one question from Jim in regards to the y-axis for the application latency. He's wondering if you can add the unit that's being used, or is it going to always be assumed as, for example, millisecond?
That's a good question, actually. Off the top of my head, I don't know, but let's take a look here. So more options here. I have some aggregation options. In this particular case, it looks like it will always be milliseconds. Yep. So I think the exception there is if you are going to do an expression, which I'll get to in a little bit, you can designate, for example, something like percentage. All right. Perfect. So moving on, I think the next thing that would help call out problem VMs would probably be something like a scatter plot. Outliers are quite obvious when you look at something like that. So let's say VM utilization. And here, capacity isn't going to be very useful for performance. Let's say memory utilization and CPU. So now you can see sort of a tier here, low CPU utilization, low memory, and there are a couple here that are very nearly maxed out entirely. So let's go create the same filter, application. You can see I'm kind of following the same pattern here. And the reason for that is just consistency when you go type into the variables. If you forget to do this on a few widgets, what you'll wind up with is that some of the views simply don't change, and so it gets a little bit confusing. But then again, in other cases, you need that to not change to keep a high-level overview. And similarly, I don't think we need to do a roll-up. We could if we wanted. We'll then ask average or max or sum, and then by particular thing. So we'll just ignore that. That looks good. So let's click Save. And make it a little wider. And then a little narrower. So I want to fit a third one over here. Save again. So just as a quick test here, if I type ERP, there we go. I can see only the VMs related to that here, where they sit. Same here, and only the chart for that. So that looks good. So let's do another one. Latency oftentimes in VMs comes out of memory or limited memory, so we start swapping quite a lot. So let's go look at our swappiness. Filter by application. Priority, again, just to filter out the noise. And then name, VM name. And, oh, actually, you know what? I made a mistake here. I didn't want another table. I wanted a scatter plot. This makes a lot more sense. And here, maybe what I'll do is look at the max swap rate for that particular VM, and then the latency to see if they're related. And so the key here is if we're not swapping out and we see high latency, we can pretty easily determine that it may not be a resource issue on the virtual machine. And we'll just say total. Actually, max, why not? Name again. And we don't need to roll anything up. So I'll call this one VM latency to swap rate. Make that a little bit more viewable. So good example here. This particular VM experiencing high latency, not really related to swap though. So I would probably start looking at storage rather than things like memory. And similarly, if I were to come down here, sure enough, only 40% memory utilization for that VM. Save again so I don't destroy my work. So coming to the question Jim had earlier, what we would want next here is sort of a table overview of virtual machine performance. So let's go by name first in this case. Application, priority high. And let's also add the data store option. That way, if we do filter on one, we'll see any VMs sitting there. Next, we'll want CPU utilization, memory, probably just our total latency. I think swap rate would be useful as well. We'll just say total. And some less performance issue related things, but still useful context would be total IOPS and IP throughput. So you can see the first thing here though, I have a whole bunch of VMs I don't actually collect performance data on. So maybe what we want to do here is sort by latency so that those are always our top view. And we'll save. Let's make that wide. Let me make it a little taller. There we go. So next thing I'll show you here is how to make an expression. This can be really useful, like I said, when you're trying to understand something as a percentage of workload or something like that. So we'll say VM write ops ratio as percent. It's a very long title, but why not? And let's go to virtual machine again. So we'll say IOPS right. Let's go ahead and create a filter first. So application, name, priority high again. Move on to name again, VM name, and also data store. Cool. So what we'll then do is click convert to expression here. And you'll see a change. We now have a second variable and an expression we can create, and then also a label and unit designation. So maybe here what I'll do is I'll say IOPS total is variable B. You can see I can also add more. But to keep it simple, maybe what I'll do here is I'll say A, actually I want a second parentheses, A divided by B. So write over total times 100, simply so I have a whole number value. And we'll just call this write ops of total. Unit as a %, for example. You can see automatically, though, there's a rollup, and this doesn't really help us much in this particular case because we're looking at all virtual machines. So let's just remove that. And we start to see something like this. It's a little bit noisier, but as soon as you filter by an application or by a data store, it will be quite clear. So let's save that. Maybe a little taller, perfect. So now just as an overview again, if I type sales and I scroll down, I'm only going to see the sales virtual machines here. And let's add a couple widgets that are more context driven. So data stores may not be my focus point, but having a quick understanding of that I think would help. So let's add a table. Data store performance is our name. Data store object. And we'll simply filter by name for data store name. I don't think we really need to do much more than that because, again, data stores don't tie directly to an application. So let's add some values here, though. Probably our IOPS total, our latency total. Throughput, I think, would be a good idea as well. Why not? And the storage it sits on. Make things a little bit clearer for us. Let's also sort that by latency. Now we have something usable. And for the last bit, I think it could not hurt to also add something for volumes in the cases where we have a data store sitting on a LUN, in NetApp speak at least. You can probably tell that I've worked for NetApp for a while. So data stores, data store application as well, because you can see a volume can be tied to an application. So that can also help you identify quickly if you don't know which data store to look for. Filtering by application can help. And then similarly, let's go add our total IOPS. Again, of course, if you're looking at something more specific than this, by all means, add that. And what could be interesting here as well, though, is tier. Let's go ahead and add that. And then also sort by latency. That's a surprising one already. And there we go. So let's take this out of edit mode. Give it a spin here, type ERP. That worked. Application VMs works. I can also see VMs that are maybe responsible for more than one app. VM utilization, I already have something I should probably investigate that might be contributing heavily to the application latency. Yeah, same thing here. Write-up percentage, you can see that there's another VM way down here that's doing only read, essentially, on rare occasion. I can see I have no LUNs for this particular one, but I do have some data stores. So yeah, I know we went a little over on time. Are there any questions?
Hey, Miles, I think there was one other question that we missed, and I believe it was referring to one of the widgets in the dashboard. Michael Resnick asking if we can copy-paste the patterns.
That's a good point. So let me go back here really quick. So if I'm not mistaken here, you can copy within the same widget. This might be a bad example. So there is a copy button here. Duplicate this query, and you'll see it adds a secondary option here. However, I am not aware of a way to, for example, copy this bit out to another widget like this. Because you'll see there's also not an import option within. It's a good point, though. I'll check on that to see if maybe that's something in development. Let me make a note on that, actually.
All right, and there's one other question here. Says, do you have some examples for monitoring SAN/Fabric switches, Brocade or Cisco?
Not one that I made today, but actually this demo box may have something. Let's take a look here. If you see something, call it out. Slow drain devices, that might be useful. So something like this. See our active ports, trend on BB credit 0, a couple single value things that just give you a high level overview on where the environment sits. You can see particular ports here. Also have added the violations table. This is actually just a default one that I mentioned before. And then you also have a list of switches. So this is just one from a demo. I think if there are questions about that, though, I'd be happy to assist with that. One thing I'll mention is the dashboards available on the automation store are editable. So a good starting point is to import those, and then you can customize them to your requirements or preferences. And lastly, I think the only other thing I'll make mention of here is that if you need additional information, there are some resources available to you. The built-in product help is actually quite helpful. I'll show that in a moment. There's also the NAB community site. There are quite a few of us active on that. So if you have questions, you can go there. You can, of course, message your success manager. That could be myself, Kyle, Joy, Chuck, anybody. And then also the automation store, there's oftentimes going to be new content added there, so keep an eye out for it. And on that note, this is kind of what the help looks like. You'll see there are quite a few how-to guides, including things like performance policies, dashboards, so some concepts on that. Similarly, can see quite a bit of discussion going on the community site. And then again, the automation store is just automationstore.nab.com. If you click on Command Insight, you'll see quite a few report options for the data warehouse. But if you click Solution Packs, this will be the dashboard section. Ooh, and some new ones added today. Look at that. Nice. And Ingo had a question about assigning dashboards to a specific user group. So let's check that. Last I checked, that was not an option. You could see the owner, but there wasn't necessarily like I think your question is related to like permissions to view the dashboard. Is that correct? There's not something in there for that currently. I'll actually take that as an action item as well. Yep. Ingo, I'll check on that, and I'll get back to you on whether that's something that might be coming in the future. All right. Well, thank you guys for the time. Sorry we went over, but hopefully that was somewhat insightful for you. If you have questions, by all means, please contact me. I'm more than happy to assist.
Thank you very much, Miles. It was a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for joining, and hope to see you next Wednesday for our next learning session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miles.
You bet.